Chapter 2191. Zhou Chengwang couldn't answer such a question at once. At this moment, it was unwise to lie to her. Silence was the most rational choice for a man. After a long time, he said, "But I care about you." Qin Mu smiled with tears in her eyes. "I can find a dozen men who care about me. Even if they care about my money, they will still treat me like this." Qin Mu's voice was slow and deep. "You enjoy your family while having countless women outside. Zhou Chengwang, what makes you think that you're still worthy of my love when you're so dirty?" Zhou Chengwang looked at her, his eyes a little blurred. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "At least give me a chance to pursue you." Qin Mu shook her head gently. "No, Zhou Chengwang, I don't want to go down the clouds with you like this." He was stunned and looked at her. Qin Mu walked past him and wanted to leave, but he grabbed her arm again and said in a deep voice, "Qin Mu." Qin Mu didn't say anything, but she was immediately dragged into his arms and kissed hard. Zhou Chengwang. All her screams were swallowed by his mouth, and then she struggled helplessly. She clenched her fists and hit his shoulders desperately, but then he grabbed her and pressed her behind him. Such a posture was very shameful. It was as if she had been folded in his arms for him to enjoy. He kissed her so deeply that Qin Mu couldn't take it anymore. In the end, she had no choice but to bite him hard. That bite was firm. Zhou Chengwang was in pain and had to let go of her. Qin Mu took a step back and turned around to escape, but her body was tightly held by him from behind. His voice was warm. "Why are you running? Are you afraid that I'll eat you, huh?" His arms were so strong that he folded her in his arms, and his voice was also warm. "Mumu, I won't touch you. Don't go, okay?" His tone was full of pleading. Qin Mu couldn't move and was extremely angry. He said it was a request, but it was so overbearing. She couldn't break free, and she didn't want to pay attention to him either. So she just stood there in a stalemate. But she didn't expect that the production crew would come over to film at this time. The scene of Zhou Chengwang hugging her was captured vividly. She didn't want to be on camera, so she turned her face to the side. Zhou Chengwang chuckled, pressed her little head on his shoulder, and said to the cameraman, "Okay, my wife is afraid of strangers. That's enough." Since the big boss had spoken, how could the people below not listen? Thus, they quickly retreated. As soon as he left, Qin Mu pushed Zhou Chengwang away and stomped on his foot. She snorted and said, "What a crooked show." The program wasn't wrong. "It was my fault." He actually admitted it in a good temper. "Mumu, don't you feel that this show is tailor-made for us?" Qin Mu sneered. "Lin Shui is still in the show." "Zhou Chengwang, aren't you embarrassed to say that?" Zhou Chengwang didn't take it seriously and chuckled. "If I'm thin-skinned, how can I coax my little wife back?" She was young, really young. He was 6 years older than her. Actually, the age difference wasn't that big, but when they got married, she was only 18. Qin Mu glared at him and walked out. This time, Zhou Chengwang didn't stop her. He just looked at her quietly and watched her walk out. If she didn't want to turn back, he could wait and not force her. When Qin Mu walked to the door, she suddenly turned around and looked at Zhou Chengwang. Chapter 2192. Qin Mu ran away in defeat. Behind her, Zhou Chengwang's smile deepened. After a while. He called the producer over and whispered a few instructions to him. The producer was shocked and hesitated for a long time. "Zhou Zong, you invested hundreds of millions in this show. If we do as you say, it will all be for naught." He still had to invest in the later stages. Spending so much money was just for fun. The producer could not understand. Had the rich changed their way of chasing women? However, he still had to cooperate with his sugar daddy. So, he immediately went back and rewrote the script. Zhou Zong liked to be alone. So, he would let them be alone, and this round of the competition was practically useless. Zhou Zong did not even finish cooking, and Mr. Yi had finished all of his food. There were other couples left, but they were just there to serve as foils. They were unimportant, all right? At noon, the production team announced that they would be taking a break in the afternoon. There would be a beach party at night. The female guests were required to wear gowns, while the male guests were free to wear whatever they wanted. Zhou Chengwang's ex-girlfriend, Lin Shui, looked at the table full of dishes and gritted her teeth. Is this show about them dating? She noticed that Zhao Yin and Gu Zhe were nowhere to be seen. Yi Muyun and Tang shared a room, while Zhou Chongwang and Qin Mu stayed together. It was only now that she realized that she and Song Karen were just cannon fodder. No one had invited them here. Even if they had come, they would have been asked to leave sooner or later. Lin Shui's face alternated between white and red. She was very indignant, but she had no other choice. She was even more unwilling to leave. She could feel that if she left now, she would never have the chance to get close to Zhou Chongwang again. Yi Muyun sat on the sofa in the bedroom and watched as Cher packed her things. He frowned and asked, "What's wrong?" Cher zipped up her luggage and sneered, "My little uncle has left. Why should I stay here?" Was he going to stay here and be bullied by him? Yi Muyun smiled faintly, looked at her, and said slowly, "I don't remember you having a crush on your uncle." Pausing for a moment, he smiled again. "You used to like sticking to me." Cher pulled the lever and glared at him. "Mr. Yi also said it was in the past, but it's different now." She emphasized her tone and childishly rolled the suitcase over his feet. Naturally, she did not hurt him. Yi Muyun reached out to hold her hand. She couldn't walk and almost fell. As for him, with just a gentle tug, she fell onto his lap and buried herself in it. "You've grown up, but you still like to throw a tantrum." He chuckled and reached out to rub her soft long hair. "What? You don't dare to stay here anymore. Are you afraid that I'll eat you?" Shuai snorted. "Of course not." He whispered in her ear, "If you don't let me touch you, I won't touch you, okay?" "I don't want to," she said willfully. Yi Muyun laughed and pinched her little face. "It's only for a few days. Are you afraid that you'll waver and fall in love with me again? Okay?" Cher looked up at him. "You're too arrogant." "I'm not." His voice became even softer, as if he was blowing air into her ear. Cher glared at him. He chuckled softly. "It's only for a week. Xiaoxin, aren't you the one with the most backbone?" He called her by her pet name, which sounded very intimate. His face was extremely handsome, and it was very bewitching. Chapter 2193. She didn't speak, which was a silent agreement. Yi Muyun sighed in his heart. This little girl, just like when she was young, couldn't resist provocation and fell for it easily. However, he really couldn't touch her casually anymore. If he did, she would probably explode and make a fuss about going home. Looking at her now, she was so promising. He thought she had grown up, but she was actually still a little kid. As he thought about it, he felt an indescribable warmth in his heart. He wanted to hold her in his arms and kiss her, just like when she was young. However, he didn't dare to act rashly. He had to take it slow. Cher looked at him and pursed her lips. Then, she dumped the suitcase on him and said shamelessly, "Help me pack. I want to sleep." He grabbed her hand and didn't let her run away immediately. He asked very slowly, "Are you sure? I remember that there are some of your private clothes in here." And to her, he was a stranger. He was just reminding her that in her heart, Yi Muyun was still very important. She just didn't realize it. She was stunned for a moment, then broke free. Ignoring him, she lay on the bed and covered her head with the blanket. He couldn't help but laugh. Was she angry or throwing a tantrum? Looking at the strand of black hair left on the pillow, he stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up her suitcase, opened it, and arranged it in the closet. He used to do these things often because she was too young and didn't know how to take care of herself. No matter how busy he was, some of her private clothes were arranged by him. Now that he was doing these things, his heart was indescribably satisfied. Yi Muyun smiled helplessly. His large palm gently stroked the lace. In the past, she didn't wear these. She always wore girly underwear and pants because he was the one who picked them out for her. In the past few years, she had fallen in love with these feminine clothes. To be honest, he seemed to have accepted it easily. His Xiaoxin was already 26 years old. She was old enough to be a mother. His gaze softened. Perhaps after a while, after they got married, they could have a child. A little Xiaoxin. Yi Muyun packed his things. Looking at his and her entwined in the closet, he felt much happier. When he walked out, his little piggy actually fell asleep. He leaned against her side and freed her little face from the blanket. In a low voice, he murmured, "You're afraid that I'll touch you, so you're sleeping like this again." He could have taken advantage of her, but he didn't want to do so. Pressing his face against hers, he said in a low voice, "Cher, will you listen to me?" She fell asleep and obediently lay in his arms, listening to his heartbeat. After a long time, their heartbeats became one and calmed down. When Cher woke up, it was already 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She and Yimuyun were not the only ones in the suite. She could hear him talking to someone from the living room. It was probably the stylist. Cher sat up and leaned against the headboard. This was obviously Zhou Chongwang's prank. How could he take it seriously? After sitting for a while, Yimuyun came in. "You're awake?" She nodded and looked up at him. "Just pick a random dress. I don't want to go through all that trouble." If she really wanted to go through all that trouble, it would take a few hours. She had gotten used to simplicity over the years and didn't like it to be complicated. Chapter 2194. When Cher got up, she suddenly said, "Have you ever thought that perhaps it's not Qinmu who is helping us, but we who are helping Zhou Chongwang?" Yimuyun's gaze was focused on her. Her gaze was clear and focused, because she had used the word "we" just now, which strangely comforted him. After a moment, he smiled faintly. "Cher, that's not important." It didn't matter who was helping whom. What was important was that he was with her at this moment. Cher looked at him. She couldn't tell what he was thinking, so she decided not to think about it anymore. When she reached the living room, she was stunned. The two stylists were fine, but what was up with the row of gowns? She was used to seeing the world, so she could tell that those weren't just any ordinary big-name gowns. They were the best of the best. How had he managed to fly dozens of gowns here in such a short time? "Pick one and style it," he said calmly, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window and pushing it open. He stood by the window and smoked, maintaining his standing posture. Schwerer looked at his handsome side profile and thought to herself, "Does this count as companionship?" She knew what he was thinking, but she could only pretend that she didn't understand. If it wasn't for that incident, she would have thrown herself into his arms without hesitation. So what if she was selfish for once? But she had too many reservations. She couldn't accept him with her status. Her heart sank. When she looked up again, she happened to meet his deep eyes. Actually, she wasn't the only one who had changed over the years. He had changed too. He had become more unfathomable, just like the collaboration between him and Zhou Chongwang. Cher didn't even dare to think about it in the past, but this time he really did it. As she thought about it, she was a little distracted as she picked out the gown. She casually picked a long white gown. It looked rather conservative. At least it covered her arms, so she wouldn't be too cold wearing it at night. But when she put it on, she gasped. The back was completely bare, and her creamy back could be seen clearly. Anyone who saw it would want to fantasize. She was in the washroom, meowing like a kitten. "Help me change into something else." She didn't want to go out like this. She didn't want others to see her like this. But she cried like a kitten, and no one could hear her. After calling for about 5 times, Yimuyun walked over and raised his eyebrows. "Let me see." Since she refused to come out, he leaned in and closed the bathroom door. "If you do this, others will think too much." She pushed him away, her voice soft. Yimuyun leaned against the door and looked at her quietly. All of a sudden, he reached out and pulled her around. Behind him was boundless spring scenery. He gasped, squinting at her. Cher felt a little uneasy, and her body was pressed into his arms again. She moved, and her voice was light. "Brother." It was because of her hidden fear that she cried out, and she regretted it the moment she cried out. She bit her lip helplessly, not knowing what to do. Yimuyun's large palm pressed her entire body against his shoulder. His voice was especially hot and even a little coaxing. "What did you call me just now, huh?" Her little body only knew how to tremble in his arms. She couldn't say a word. Chapter 2195. He bit her little ear and said in a deep voice, "Little liar, you obviously haven't forgotten about me." His large palm touched his back. At this moment, he felt that the design of this dress was damn good. It was too convenient, but he couldn't let her wear it outside. Cher was extremely afraid of him acting so recklessly, afraid that he would do something. But how could he stand it when she was dressed like a vixen and called him brother? He lowered his head and kissed her little mouth. At the same time, he tightened his arms and pressed her into his embrace. Cher bit her lip and cried out, "You said that you wouldn't touch me." But those words were swallowed by him again and again. It was as though he wanted to swallow her whole. She was afraid and excited at the same time. Her nose was filled with his masculine scent. It was intoxicating. She struggled with all her might, but she couldn't break free. He was always aware of her body's weakness. Not only did he not let her escape, but he also ignited her little flame. The kiss became more and more seductive. He didn't kiss deeply, but he succeeded in seducing her. That feeling of wanting it, but not being able to do it, completely drove Cher crazy. She tiptoed and wanted to touch his lips, but he moved away. After a few missed kisses, the little guy got angry and wanted to push him away. But at this moment, he chuckled and took her little mouth, gently giving her what she wanted. Their lips and teeth intertwined as they challenged each other again and again. Her little heart was beating extremely fast. At this moment, she forgot about everything. She forgot that she had no choice but to kiss him based on her instinct. There were always people outside, so he had to be careful about what he wanted to do. Finally, the kiss ended. When it ended, Schwer's little hand was still wrapped around his neck. That tiny bit of tenderness almost drove him crazy. He said hoarsely, "Do you like it?" Her eyes were still glistening, and it was extremely alluring. Looking at her like that, he couldn't help but lower his head and kiss her lightly again. He just couldn't get enough. As he kissed her, he thought of the past 8 years, and his heart fell a little wet. She let him kiss her, but she lowered her eyes, and her rationality returned bit by bit. In the kiss, just now, she was very clear about how much she had invested herself into it, and how much she had taken the initiative. So now that she had sobered up, it was clearly not rational for her to slap him. While being kissed by him, Cher was trying to come up with an excuse to escape. She admitted that she had been mesmerized by him just now. She despised herself countless times in her heart. It wasn't like she had never seen a man before. How did she fall for his trick? After a long time, she coughed and said, "Can you help me change into a dress?" He lowered his head to look at her. She turned her little face to the side, refusing to communicate with him. "You can also keep this one. It's quite convenient to wear it at home." His voice was slightly hoarse, and it revealed a dangerous tension. Moreover, his words were filled with dense hints. What a shameless hint. If it was in the past, Cher would have retorted and said that he was shameless. But now, she had learned to be obedient. She would let him do whatever he wanted. She would never try to curry favor with him. She replied with a hum and raised her head. "Help me pick one." He looked at her little face that was flushed red. His heart skipped a beat as he hugged her once more. His voice was even hoarser now. "I really don't want anyone to see you like this. What should I do, baby? I want to lock you up at home." He leaned against her forehead and murmured in a deep voice that was indescribably intimate. She turned her head away and bit down on her lips. "Hurry and go." Chapter 2196. Cher turned her face away and pursed her lips. "Yi Mu-yoon, don't call me that." They were no longer in that kind of relationship. She couldn't take it anymore. Yi Mu-yoon's gaze was burning as he looked at her little face. After a while, he chuckled. "Indeed, you've grown up. You shouldn't call me baby anymore." "Baby? I'm not your baby," she muttered softly before pushing him. "Hurry up and go pick out your clothes." However, he did not move and continued to lock her body in place. Cher glared at him. Yi Mu-yoon chuckled. "Say it. Please, brother." In the past, she would beg him like this whenever he refused to give her anything she wanted. Cher pursed her lips and refused. Yi Mu-yoon did not force her. He kissed her and went out first. After he left, Cher's legs were trembling. It had been 8 years. She still could not control herself when she was with him. Every kiss and gaze from him was enough to stir her up and make her unable to control herself. About 5 minutes later, he walked in again with a short white gown in his hand. "Change into this," he said calmly. Cher took it and pursed her lips. "You go out first." Yi Mu-yoon smiled and went out first. Cher changed into the gown and looked at herself in the mirror. It was a simple design with a knee-length skirt. It was indeed suitable for outdoor dinners. She walked out and matched it with a pair of silver high heels. Finally, the stylist helped her tie her hair up and pinned it with a small diamond. The person in the mirror looked fresh and beautiful. Cher looked at herself. She had to admit that he had good taste and knew what suited her best. His figure appeared in the mirror. He was still wearing a white shirt and black trousers. However, the shirt was not tied at his waist. Even so, it was hard to hide his aura. Yoon stood behind her and looked at the person in the mirror with her. She did not know when a necklace had appeared in his hand. Cher only came back to her senses when she felt a cold sensation on her neck. It was an ice blue diamond necklace. The entire necklace was made up of 108 aqua blue diamonds and 1,008 colorless fine diamonds. Wearing it on her neck, it was as if she was wearing an entire ocean on her fair neck. "Brilliant," he said in a low voice. Shue lifted her head and looked at him. "This is too precious." Then she remembered that the necklace had been auctioned off last week and bought by a mysterious buyer. She remembered that it was worth more than $800 million. Yoon's voice was very calm. "It's not valuable if it's suitable for you." With that, he straightened his body and held her hand. "Let's go." Cher stared at him without moving for a long time. His voice was hoarse. "If we're late, it'll be too late." Slowly, she finally placed her hand in his palm. She told herself that this was just a reality show and everything was like an illusion. After a few days, everything would go back to normal. She would return to America, and he would continue to be the president of Boise. He might find a girlfriend like Song Karen. She looked up at his back as she thought about it, and tears welled up in her eyes. Yoon held her little hand all the way out of the hotel. Chapter 2197. The hotel had a large central garden, which was very suitable for holding a banquet. Behind it was a magnificent building that was lit up in the night, and in front of it was a vast ocean, mysterious and unfathomable. The two completely different feelings mixed together, and it was especially artistic. At this moment, the huge fountain in the garden of the open-air party was opened. Unlike other places, the water that gushed out was light blue and glowed faintly. The statue of the saintess in the middle seemed to be smiling under the music. Yoon held Cher's hand as they walked through the party. She was surprised to find that there were so many celebrities tonight. Although she was born into a good family, it was still a little strange to see so many celebrities at once. "I'm in charge of King Entertainment for the time being," Yoon explained calmly. "Oh," Cher replied and didn't ask any more questions. Actually, she knew that he had already become the vice president of Boise at Chin Mo's age. That kind of hardship was something she couldn't imagine. So she looked up and took a few more glances at him. Yoon pulled her hand closer and let her hold it. She didn't refuse because the theme of the night was this kind of double party. There was no reason for her to embarrass him on such an occasion. Her slender fingers grasped his arm and felt his muscles bulge. Was he nervous? She couldn't help but look up at him again. "Tang Cher, if you keep looking at me like this, we'll probably be in the newspapers tomorrow. The headline is not something you want to see." His voice was calm, and there was a hint of a smile in it. Cher pursed her lips and didn't say anything else. He smiled and walked over to greet familiar people. Cher realized that it wasn't just celebrities. There were also many people in the business world. Most of them were young, so she hadn't noticed it just now. She quickly realized that this was a business gathering. It was very likely that he already had a schedule, so he took part in a reality show along the way. Now, she finally understood why he was so free. Thinking of this, the guilt in her heart lessened a little. Yoon handed her a glass of cocktail and smiled faintly. "What are you thinking about?" Cher looked around for a while before returning her gaze to his face. She pursed her lips and said, "I want to know the relationship between these people." Her heart was beating fast, and her face was hot. She cared about this. She didn't want him to be the kind of person who would sacrifice his female celebrities for his own interests, whether they were together or not. She hoped that he was respectful to women. Or rather, in her heart, he had always been lofty. Yoon smiled faintly. "Cher, why do you care so much? Do you care about their circumstances? Or do you care about what kind of person I am?" She shook her head slightly. He was too powerful and understood her too well. Nothing about her could be hidden from him. In front of someone as powerful as Yi Muyun, she was almost transparent. She hesitated for a moment before saying, "You clearly know." His smile deepened, and he gently touched his glass with hers. "I'll tell you after you drink this glass of wine." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. Ever since they were young, he had always bullied her like this. She refused to drink it and said a little angrily, "It has nothing to do with me anyway." After saying that, she turned her face away. He looked at her side profile, and his smile deepened. Chapter 2198. His fingers gently pinched her soft little face. It had been 8 years, and she was still as soft as before. Moreover, there was a milky scent on her body. On such a night, he couldn't help but pull her into his arms. She was so petite, and it was just right for him to place her in his arms. He kissed her forehead and said hoarsely, "You're already so big, and there's still a milky scent on your body." He closed his eyes and rubbed his face against her hair. "Smelling like this, I feel like I'm hugging a child." She couldn't break free. Moreover, she had to give him face in such an occasion. She lay on his shoulder and said in a low voice, "But you smell like a stinky man." He chuckled and nibbled her behind the ear. Cher whined, "You're a dog." There were so many people around, and they could be photographed at any time. In fact, their kiss had already been photographed, and it was a beautiful scene. Cher struggled a little, but couldn't break free. She said softly, "Let go of me." He used more force and hugged her in his arms. One of his large palms was getting a little unruly. Cher's face was a little red. "Yi Muyun, there are so many people watching." He was already dancing with her in his arms. Even though his actions weren't easy to be seen, she still felt pressured in front of so many people. "Look around." His thin lips were near her ear, and he said in a low voice, "Haven't you been to such an occasion before?" Cher was a little suspicious. She turned her head and saw that everyone was hugging each other, just like them. She dared to say that these people weren't all couples or lovers. She was stunned. His thin lips were near her ear, and he said softly, "This is Hai Tian Shangyan." Cher looked especially surprised as she looked up and stared at him. At this moment, her expression was really cute. Her eyes were wide open, and her mouth was in an O shape. She was just short of 2 pointy ears. As he watched, he felt an indescribable satisfaction in his heart. He laughed and scolded, "Idiot! Where's your brains gone all these years, eh?" he said, kissing her ear passionately. Cher couldn't avoid it and said angrily, "I don't want to join." She had always been pure, so she didn't want to participate in such a bad gathering. Furthermore, it was supposed to be a reality show. How did it end up in a place like this? She struggled, and he had no choice but to hold her little body in place. Very softly, he said, "It's organized by Zhou Chengguang. He's been organizing it for 4 years." Cher was stunned. Then, she gritted her teeth. "You didn't even do anything about it. All these years, he's been messing around. Are you just going to watch him let Chimu down? Then what about me leaving back then?" After she finished speaking, he did not reply, and she herself was a little regretful. She seemed to have said something that she shouldn't have, because with their current relationship, what she said was a little too deep. After a long time, he hugged her slender waist with one hand and cupped her little face with the other, forcing her to lift him up. Cher pursed her lips, looking a little stubborn, looking as though she didn't want to communicate with him anymore. He knew that the reason why she could say so much was probably because she had a little more alcohol. Chapter 2199. Cher looked at him helplessly, not understanding what he was trying to do. But then he bent down and kissed her little mouth. After a long kiss, he fed her all the wine. Tears welled up in her eyes. Because the alcohol level was a little high, it was spicy and uncomfortable to hold in her mouth. But he had the intention to make her drunk. He fed her mouthful after mouthful. After 1 glass of alcohol, she was already slightly tipsy. In fact, she could hold her liquor well, but with his kiss, she became the most intoxicating thing in the world. Her body began to grow hot and weak, and she lay limp in his arms, unable to move for a moment. Yi Muyun's voice was low. "Do you want more?" She shook her head. Her legs were a little weak, and she could only hang her slender arms around his neck. leaning on his body to support herself. She knew that he wanted to make her drunk, but she couldn't resist. After drinking too much, she became a little crazy. She opened her mouth and bit hard on his shoulder. He was only wearing a shirt. She easily bit him, and very soon, she tasted the sweetness of blood. Immerse let go of her, treating her like a child. Cher finally let go of him. She looked at the faint pink stain on his white shirt. He was bleeding. "Does it hurt?" she asked him softly. Her eyes were like the brightest stars in the sky. Only when she was drunk would she dare to be so concerned about him, and only then would she dare to mess around so openly. Perhaps she had been more repressed than he had in the past 8 years. Immerse kept looking at her and smiled faintly. "You can help me." As soon as he finished speaking, the little kitten lowered its head and licked his wound very gently and softly. She looked especially focused, as if she had a lifetime to do so. At this moment, there was no one else. In the entire universe, only Immerse and Cher were left. His voice was gentle. "Cher, these are both consensual. There is too much darkness in this world, and I can't stop it." He paused for a moment before continuing. "As for Zhou Chengwang, I used to hope that he would be as bad as possible, so that Qin Mu would come to her senses. But looking at them now, I'm a little hesitant. I wasn't a hesitant person before. Perhaps it was because of their reunion that his heart softened a little. Perhaps it was because of her that he had allowed Zhou Chengwang to do whatever he wanted all these years. He was so conflicted that he didn't even know what he really thought." Cher pursed her lips and looked up at him with a dazed expression. "Actually, you don't have to explain to me." "Then who am I going to explain to?" He said somewhat mischievously. "My girlfriend left because of you." Cher was originally treating his wound. Now that she was angry, she bit him again. "It's obvious that you're the irresponsible one." He smiled bitterly and lowered his head, pressing his face against hers. "In this world, I only want to be responsible for one person." Cher didn't say anything. She was drunk and knew that she couldn't answer him. After a long pause, he looked at her. Actually, Song Ku is not a bad person," she said very slowly. "Do you want to consider getting her back?" As soon as she finished speaking, her little mouth was kissed. Chapter 2200. In the end, her back hit a wall. The cold wall woke her up temporarily. She opened her eyes and looked at his slightly twisted face. He was angry. Was it because she said Song Karen? He was the girlfriend he found himself. Why was he angry now? She bit him unceremoniously. He retreated in pain, but his fingers were still holding onto her shoulder, unwilling to let go. Cher's heart was heaving up and down. She pursed her lips and glared at him. Then a slap was thrown over. The atmosphere was a little tense. He hadn't expected her to hit him in such a situation. What gave her the courage to do so all these years? Immerse's face was very ugly, but he just glared at her and didn't do anything to her. "I'm not the little girl from before. You can't kiss me whenever you want." Her voice was a little cold. "Also, between you and Song Karen, it has nothing to do with me." He said that he didn't touch her, so there must be something between them. She wouldn't take the blame for breaking up. Immerse kept looking at her. Then he chuckled and leaned against the side. Angry, he knew what she was thinking. She still cared about him finding a girlfriend. Although she said that she didn't care, her anger was all because of that slap just now. "I'm not angry." She bit her lip. "I want to go back to the room. Accompany me to the dinner party or go back to the room to make love. You choose." He once again pressed her little face into his embrace and shamelessly pressed his lips against her little neck, kindly giving her a choice. Cher was a little annoyed. Is there a difference? Looking at him now, he wouldn't let her off even after the dinner party. Just like now, his body was already expressing it. Yi Muyun smiled. It was a very satisfied smile. "Good girl." Then, he held her hand and walked to the center of the party again, giving her a reprieve. He fed her a lot of alcohol until she was drunk. He was actually shocked. In the past, Cher didn't have much alcohol tolerance, but now she could drink a few glasses of strong alcohol. Although he couldn't bear to do it, he made up his mind to force her to do it. He always had a plan in mind. He knew in his heart that she wouldn't easily stay, so a child was the best, fastest, and most direct method. In the past, he always felt that she was still young and that he had to wait a few years. Now, he somewhat regretted it. If they had killed each other at that time, perhaps they would not have been separated for these 8 years. Qin Mu and Zhou Chengwang stood far away. Qin Mu looked worried. She tilted her head and looked at Zhou Chengwang. "Brother, you seem to have made Cher drink a lot. Are you sure you're okay?" Zhou Chengwang stared into the distance for a long time before he retracted his gaze and smiled faintly. "Your brother would never hurt her." Zhou Chengwang was a man, and he knew how men thought. Yi Muyun was probably thinking the same thing as him. He wanted to use a child to tie down Tang Cher, and he wanted Qin Mu to conceive a child. His mentality had changed. At this moment, he thought that it didn't seem so hard to stay with a woman for the rest of his life. If Tang Cher was a sad dream of his youth, then Qin Mu was a cup of tea in his life. Chapter 2201. Now, he thought that she hadn't been pregnant all these years because she had been deliberately using contraception, but he hadn't noticed it. It was him who had neglected her. She had wanted to leave him a long time ago, but she hadn't found a breaking point, so it had dragged on until now. In other words, she hadn't been happy at all in the past 8 years. This was a big blow to a man like Zhou Chengwang. At this time, Yi Muyun had already taken Cher away. Qin Mu's fingers clenched Zhou Chengwang's arm, and she said nervously, "Will something happen?" Zhou Chengwang couldn't help laughing. He looked down at his little wife and said helplessly, "Mu, do you want them to reconcile or not?" Then, he said something about a man's opinion. In fact, sometimes feelings are formed through sleeping. Really? Then did you, Gume, Lin Shui, Zhao Shui, and Li Shui fall in love with each other? Qin Mu sneered. Zhou Chengwang touched his nose and knew that he had poked a hornet's nest. He chuckled and looked at her. "But the one I slept with the most is Mrs. Zhou." He immediately added, "In the future, only you." He reached out and hugged her, smelling her pleasant smell. Qin Mu had a faint smell of chrysanthemum on her body. Maybe it was the smell of the shower gel she liked to use. She rarely used perfume, but this smell was even better than perfume. He had never thought that he would be infatuated with his wife. The excitement of these nights was not only because he wanted to keep her, but also because he was really attached to her body. He had long passed the age of a young man, and he couldn't even count the number of women he had slept with. But recently, he couldn't restrain himself at all. He always pressed her down several times, every night. Of course, Qin Mu didn't want to, but she couldn't struggle, so she had to comply. She just didn't want to give him a reaction. Zhou Chengwang had a man's bad habit. The more she was unwilling, the more he forced her. Under all kinds of torture, she would always surrender and even beg him. After a long time, he began to enjoy it. Every time he teased her like this, he felt an indescribable satisfaction in his heart. This was an extreme feeling that surpassed the physical body. He felt that he had already become addicted to it. Zhou Chengwang would sometimes lament that he had wasted 8 years and lost so much fun. He even thought, if before she turned 18, just like that, would she cry a lot? He couldn't think about it. Just thinking about it made his blood boil. Even he himself felt that he was a pervert. However, Qin Mu didn't know any of this. He did not dare to let her know. He only showed that he was willing to let her know. As for infatuation, it was fine as long as he knew. He was a man who liked to take things slow. Therefore, during this period of time, the women outside were not attractive to him at all. As he said that, Qin Mu glared at him with a meaningful look. "You're a pervert." He smiled helplessly and put his hand in his pocket. "Mrs. Zhou, would you like to dance with a pervert?" Yi Muyun left. This place still needed someone to hold up. Qin Mu looked at him suspiciously, but she still danced with him. She didn't really care anymore. If he wanted to do it at night, she wouldn't reject him too much. She would just treat it as if she was bitten by a dog. Moreover, she would treat him as a free gigolo. Anyway, the divorce was still going to happen. In Qin Mu's heart, he thought happily. Chapter 2202. However, Zhou Chengwang didn't think so. In his eyes, Qin Mu was just a harmless little sheep with weak resistance. She must feel that it didn't matter that she had slept with him for nothing, right? But after so many years of being husband and wife, she didn't know that he, Zhou Chengguang, never did useless things. He had spent so much effort on her, and he wouldn't accept the result of their separation. His little Moo didn't know that. Qin Mu put her hand in his palm and slid onto the dance floor with his strength. This was the first time the couple had appeared in public. Zhou Chengguang danced very well. Being led by him, Qin Mu silently wondered which woman had taught him his dancing skills. However, she could only think about it and could only smile bitterly. She didn't need to care too much about a man who didn't belong to her. Qin Mu spun in his arms and smelled the fragrance on his body. She was a little drunk. The blue night sky and the stars were shining. Dancing under such a sky was the most romantic thing, but everything now was unreal. Qin Mu's voice was very low. Zhou Chengguang, we've never been real, have we? He suddenly hugged Qin Mu tightly, closed his eyes, and said in a slightly pained voice, No, Mu. When I hugged you, it was real, and it's real now. He tightened his arms, letting her feel his strength and his emotions. Do you feel it now? Qin Mu buried her face in his arms and said softly, Zhou Chengguang, it's a little too late. He gently stroked her long hair and said in a hoarse voice, Mu, we're still young. It won't be too late. He pressed his face against her little face, which was an intimate gesture that he had never done before. It was as if he was laying himself out in front of her, but he didn't care at all. He had never been so eager to share everything with his wife. He pressed his forehead against hers and said in a low voice, Mu, are you willing? His fingers slowly circled around her small palm and became tightly intertwined. This gesture made Qin Mu a little resistant. She pursed her lips and said, No. Why not? His voice was hoarse. Mu, are you afraid? At the end of his sentence, his own voice sounded a little light. How could Qin Mu stand him like this? When they were together, he was always gentle to her. At that time, she thought they were in love, but in fact, she was just hot-headed. But when a man like Zhou Chengguang deliberately released his charm to you, it was hard for a girl like Qin Mu to resist. Qin Mu desperately shook her head, but she couldn't win against him. He kept holding on to her and teased her naughtily. How could she be his opponent? She was easily defeated. Her slender body was trembling slightly in his arms. Zhou Chengguang lowered his head and looked at his little wife in his arms. She was very beautiful tonight. She was wearing an ice blue dress that accentuated her figure. There was a sapphire called the Heart of the Ocean on her neck. From his direction, he could faintly see some spring scenery. At this moment, he couldn't hold back anymore. He regretted it. He should have taken her away earlier instead of staying here to support her. Chapter 2203. Qin Mu raised her eyes and looked at him eagerly. After a long while, she resisted weakly and said, No, but Mu, I want. His voice was hoarse and sexy. He clasped her fingers and began to kiss her lightly. It was a very light kiss like a spring breeze. Qin Mu pursed her lips tightly, afraid that he would kiss her deeply. She was very nervous. She had been a very orthodox girl since she was a child, and she had never been so intimate with anyone outside. His words also made her blush, so she turned her face away uncomfortably. Zhou Chengguang's eyes were a little deep. His thin lips covered her ear, and he said in a low voice, Mu, you don't know how charming you are. Zhou Chengguang. She pursed her lips and glared at him. Zhou Chengguang chuckled and reached out to touch her little face again. Little fool. She lowered her head and said weakly, Don't do this. What do you mean? You're charming, or I want you, huh? He teased her and bullied her to his heart's content. Qin Mu could only raise her eyes and try her best to stare at him. He was extremely happy and felt that his little wife was really cute. He reached out to rub her and said in a particularly seductive voice, Fool. He grabbed her and suddenly carried her in his arms. There were cheers all around, and Qin Mu screamed, but her screams were drowned out. She could only hit him and struggle desperately. Zhou Chengguang, what are you doing? He hugged her effortlessly and said in a hot voice, I just want to fuck you. He had never said such rough words to her before. He couldn't bear to say it to her. But now that he had said it to her, her reaction made him feel excited. He had never felt this way before. It was as if he had never done it with her before, and he couldn't wait to fuck her. Clearly, they had already done it countless times, but now he wanted to please her, thoroughly please her, make her happy, make her feel that this was a wonderful thing. It must be said that Zhou Chengwang was quite shameless in recent years. He was addicted to alcohol and women, and he was especially good with women. However, he had never waited on a woman before, so he didn't need to. Qin Mu became the subject of his experiment. For the whole night, Qin Mu's life was worse than death. Did he know how to do it? Why was he always torturing her like this? Also, doesn't he find it dirty? However, Zhou Chengwang was so excited that he couldn't stop. He didn't let her go until 2 in the morning. Qin Mu was too tired to argue with him. She fell asleep as soon as she closed her eyes. Zhou Chengwang lay beside her and calmed down for a while. Then he propped himself up and looked at her quietly. She had never experienced anything like this before. She was probably exhausted. He reached out his hand and touched her rosy little face, smiling faintly. Qin Mu's face had always been a little pale, but after this round, her complexion was surprisingly good. He shamelessly thought that this kind of exercise was good for her too. After looking at her for a long time, he got out of bed and went to the bathroom to get a hot towel. He carefully wiped her clean. As he wiped, his breathing became erratic again, and he was actually a little aroused. Zhou Chengwang secretly scolded himself a few times and focused on cleaning her up. Chapter 2204. He had asked the doctor about the medicine she prescribed. It was a long-term contraceptive pill, and it would not cause much damage to the body. Of course, he had already changed the medicine. Stroking her delicate face with his fingers, he was already looking forward to her giving birth to a cute and awkward little girl like her. He would definitely make up for these 8 years with their child. At that time, she would probably forgive him slowly. After lying flat, Zhou Chengwang didn't feel sleepy. He kept looking at Qin Mu's little face under the dim light. It was as if he couldn't get tired of looking at her. Sometimes people were like this. When they got something, they didn't know how to cherish it. Everything was taken for granted. When they lost it, they suddenly realized that it had become a habit. Fortunately, they hadn't divorced yet. Fortunately, she still had him in her heart. Otherwise, she wouldn't be willing to have a relationship with him. Zhou Chengwang was sure about this. He kept looking at her and didn't fall asleep until dawn. He felt that he had only slept for a short while when he heard the sound of Qin Mu getting up. Her voice was very soft, as if she was afraid of waking him up, but he knew that she didn't care about him, but secretly got up to take the contraceptive pill. She didn't let him know, probably because she didn't want to have a conflict with him. Zhou Chengwang closed his eyes and didn't say anything. After she finished taking the pill, she actually climbed into bed again. The corners of his mouth curled up. She was probably really tired. Qin Mu first lay flat on his back. Then he turned around after a long time. He seemed to turn over inadvertently and hug her slender waist from behind. His voice was also low and hoarse. Mumu. Her voice was a little light, because his palm had touched something that he shouldn't have touched. The corners of Zhou Chengwang's mouth curled up, and his voice was extremely hoarse. Sleep with me for a while more. With that, he buried his face in her neck. Qin Mu's body was a little stiff. How could she fall asleep with him like this? Her body was stiff, and she didn't dare to move. It wasn't until she felt that he didn't mean it that she slowly closed her eyes and fell asleep. When her breathing was even, Zhou Chengwang gently opened his eyes, and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. Their relationship was getting better, but she probably didn't dare to think about Mumu. Burying his face in the pillow, he took a deep breath of her scent and fell asleep. This time, there was only Qin Mu in his world, and no one else. Just as they were sleeping soundly, Guze stood by the sea, still standing at the place where Qin Mu sat last time. He stood there for a whole night, but in fact he did not leave. He knew that Qin Mu and Zhou Chengwang showed signs of reconciliation. He smiled bitterly. Yes, how could she not be soft-hearted? She used to like Zhou Chengwang so passionately. Once this man expressed his feelings for her, how could she escape? Guze thought bitterly that this was also good. It It would save his silly sister from waiting bitterly. Now that they had reconciled, Gumei should have given up. It was Zhou Chengwang's order that Gumei went abroad, but Gu Zhang knew that she had not given up. She was not a person who was greedy for power. If she had given up, she would have left Glory Group directly, but she didn't. Gu Zhang thought that he should fly to Paris and have a good talk with Gumei. Gu Zhang couldn't stay here for a long time, so he went to Yi Muyun's bedroom to say goodbye. However, when he walked to the door, he heard the sound of something breaking inside. It seemed to be a fierce fight. Gu Zhang paused, shook his head, and decided not to say goodbye. Chapter 22:05. In the suite, Cher was smashing the things in the bedroom into smithereens. When a person was drunk and woke up, they realized that their body was unrecognizable, and there were red kisses all over. When you were standing in front of the mirror in a daze, the instigator still dared to stand behind you. It was hard not to be angry when he shamelessly repeated what happened last night. No matter how much she struggled, it was useless. He just did it shamelessly, and he even used many indescribable methods. Cher recalled that he wasn't like this in the past. Perhaps it was because he was young and inexperienced, and he always used traditional methods. Now, it was simply indescribable. Cher was angry as she smashed the things in the suite. Her face was so red that it seemed like it was dripping blood. Yi Muyun tried his best to hide, but he couldn't avoid it. He looked at her, his gaze a little indifferent. Cher, can you be more rational? Why can't you be more rational when you're crazy? She said angrily. How do you expect me to go out and meet people? Yi Muyun touched the wound on his forehead. It was bleeding, but her face was not red, and her heart was not beating. How heartless. He looked at her with a burning gaze. We're staying in the same room. Unless I'm a eunuch, I won't touch you. Why do you care about this? Cher was furious. Was he still in the right? So she gritted her teeth. Are you willing to let me do it all over your neck? He looked at her good-naturedly. If you're happy, I don't mind. Shui glared at him. He was really shameless. So she didn't stand on ceremony. She directly pounced on him and bit his neck. She couldn't do it warmly, so she bit him like a little puppy. Yi Muyun's heart was warm. He called the little puppy softly, and the little puppy bit him even more happily. She wanted to bite him to death. Shameless and shameless. As they bit, the taste changed. After all, they were only wearing bathrobes. It was hard not to have sparks when they hugged each other. By the time Cher realized the danger, it was already too late. Her body was lifted off the ground and placed on the countertop. Her back was pressed against the cold surface of the mirror. Yi Muyun, she screamed in fear. She reached out and hugged his neck, not letting him touch her. Even now, her legs were still sore. Call me brother, and I won't touch you. He coaxed her and kissed her hair. Her whole body was refreshing, with a milky fragrance, a smell that he yearned for. Cher refused, so she hugged him and didn't let him have a chance to move. Weren't you very powerful just now, huh? His voice was a little malicious. Snow hurriedly hugged him tightly and humped softly. I apologize. Looks like you've learned to be flexible over the years. Not bad. He chuckled. Call me brother, and I promise I won't touch you. She was really afraid of him. In the end, she had no choice but to cry out softly. Her voice was as soft as a kitten. Brother, I beg you. His eyes were smiling, and he hooked her chin with his fingers. Be good. Tell me what you're begging me for. Her softness after she was drunk was like the strongest medicine that touched his heart. Cher looked at him. Her eyes were watery, but she was cursing in her heart. She was begging him? Begging him. Chapter 22:06. I heard that sometimes women don't mean what they say. His voice was hoarse. Let me check. As she screamed, he got what he wanted. How could she not miss him? They were in such a situation. She was a normal woman, and she had liked him so much. In the end, it was a little crazy. She was a little anxious because of him, and she wasn't as obedient as before. In the mirror, there was a lingering figure. As the temperature rose, the mirror became blurry. When everything calmed down, he leaned on her shoulder and bit her. Are you okay? She turned her face away. Not good. Her tone was a little unhappy and a little angry. Yi Muyun chuckled and kissed her neck. I'll take you to take a shower. At this moment, in his heart, they were already together again. He was willing to dote on her as much as he wanted. When she first came back, he actually hated her. He was thinking of how to treat her cruelly and get back at her for all these years. But he was actually weaker than her, and he couldn't stand the loneliness. He had been lonely for so long that he couldn't reject her company. She could scold him, hit him, or anything else as long as she was by his side. When he turned on the shower to clean her up, his heart was full, and he continued kissing her. Cher didn't want to talk to him. After she couldn't stand it anymore, she said, Yi Muyun, we're just not that intimate. Don't be like this. She couldn't bear his kindness. He didn't stop and just glanced at her. Do you think that doing it again will prove whether we're intimate or not? He paused for a moment and said in a tone that made people's hair stand on end, If you want to continue, I don't mind doing it again. Cher covered her face and didn't say anything. The water continued to flow, and she was very close to him. Slowly, she tasted the sweetness of blood. When she looked up, she was stunned. His forehead was broken, and dark red blood was slowly flowing down. Why didn't you say so earlier? Her voice was a little anxious. She reached out to touch his forehead, but the more she touched, the more red water poured down. She bit her lips. Yi Muyun, are you an idiot? You're clearly injured, so why did you use hot water to wash it? This way, the wound will open up, okay? He was unmoved. He even grabbed her little hand and looked at her with a burning gaze. Because of this, you will be anxious and nervous about me. He looked at her with bitterness in his heart. Cher, no one has ever dared to call me an idiot. You are the first. Only in front of you. I am an idiot because of love, so stupid. You were so angry, so concerned about my shamelessness last night, so I could only hurt myself. This way, you probably wouldn't be in the mood to be angry. He admitted that he was despicable and shameless, but for the sake of the person he liked, why not be careful? From the bottom of his heart, the current Zhou Chengwang was the same type of person as him. He didn't mind if Qin Mu fell in love with Zhou Chengwang once more, as long as Zhou Chengwang treated Qin Mu well. But he was different from Cher. She seemed to have many secrets in her heart. Since she wasn't willing to say them out and get close to him, he could only force himself on her. He didn't care about his injury. After all, he wouldn't die. But Cher cared. She hurriedly turned off the hot water and dragged him to the bedroom. Along the way, there were splashes everywhere. Chapter 2207. She returned to the bed with much difficulty and found the first aid kit in the suite with a pale face. She didn't even bother to put on her clothes and came over to help him apply the medicine. Put on your clothes. He leaned against the headboard with an unfathomable gaze. Cher glared at him. I won't catch a cold. As she said that, she applied the medicine for him carefully. She was kneeling in front of him. To be honest, this posture was indeed a huge test for him. Yi Muyun admired it for a long time before saying indifferently, I'm afraid I won't be able to control myself. Cher paused and shifted her gaze to his face. Although he looked like a precious jade, the words that came out of his mouth were extremely shameless. She covered herself immediately and bit her lips. You're still thinking about that when things are already like this. It's not like I'm going to die. His voice became even softer as he grabbed her shoulders and asked softly, Were you satisfied last night? Cher's face blushed. She wanted to escape, but she couldn't. She could only pretend to apply the medicine for him carefully. She despised him in her heart. He was no different from Zhou Chengwang right now. Despising him was one thing, but she didn't want anything to fall behind just because they had a night together. She thought that they should leave well and not owe each other anything. Cher's gaze fell on the bin beside the bed. There were 5 to 6 zero ones in it, all of which were used by them last night. There were 2 more in the bathroom. She thought that he really couldn't control himself. Was he too hungry all these years? Why? She was too embarrassed to ask what she wanted to ask. Yi Muyun looked at her and touched the gauze on his forehead. He smiled. Why do I need protection? Cher knelt in front of him, her eyes watery as she nodded. Because I don't want you to take the medicine. He sighed. Cher, I promise that I won't let you get pregnant before you're willing. When she heard that, she didn't feel too touched. She just felt a little embarrassed. Were they now? They were nothing. Because she couldn't, she lowered her eyes. Rest for a while. I'll get someone to clean it up. He didn't lose a lot of blood, but he had just flushed it. She was afraid that it would get infected, and that would be troublesome. She had only moved a little when he caught her arm. His voice was extremely hoarse. Sleep with me for a while. Before she came back to her senses, she was tightly hugged in his arms. He hugged her like how he used to hug a child in the past. Placing her in his arms, he rested his chin on her hair and said in a low voice, Cher, stay with me. I'm very sleepy and tired. All these years, he had almost never had a good night's sleep. When he woke up, he would always feel that his side was empty. Later, he developed the habit of sleeping only 4 hours a day. He was afraid that he would forget her. Cher stayed in his arms, feeling a little sad. She didn't know whether it was for him or for herself. She knew that what she was doing now was unfair to him. She should make it clear to him, but she couldn't. Hugging him with her slender arms, she told herself that she would indulge herself just this once. After this was over, she would leave. This time around, he would probably hate her even more and forget about her. The two of them hugged and fell asleep slowly. Even their breathing was mixed together, blending together in a strange way. When Cher woke up, she felt a burning sensation. Hugging her was a warm body. Chapter 22:08. Cher pursed her lips, not knowing what to do. She knelt beside him for a long time before she reached out and said in a trembling voice, Brother. Yi slowly opened his eyes and saw her anxious look. He seemed to have heard her calling him brother. It had been a long time since she had called him brother from the bottom of her heart. He had forced her to call him brother previously, so it was naturally different from this. Don't cry. He reached out and caressed her face. It's just a little fever, it's nothing. Cher's eyes were filled with tears, and she said in a low voice, I'll call the doctor for you then. There would definitely be a doctor on duty in such a big hotel. Yi was also really uncomfortable. She closed her eyes and let out a sound of agreement. The voice that came out of his throat was hoarse and unclear. It was obvious how uncomfortable he was at the moment. She got up and put on some clothes. After thinking about it, she helped him pull up his bathrobe. Yi opened his eyes and looked at her. Then he chuckled softly. You're still concerned about this even at this stage. I'm not as thick-skinned as you. Cher's voice was soft, and she ran out. When Yi heard the door close, he smiled helplessly. He lay there quietly, feeling as though his body was being torn apart. It was very painful, but last night, he had enjoyed it to his heart's content. Especially when he was taking her, she kept crying in his arms, and that gave him a great sense of satisfaction. The corners of his chapped lips turned up into a smile. After some time, the door opened again, and the person who had just arrived came over quietly. Cher, he called out to her as he searched for her by the bed. Cher hesitated for a moment, but she still went forward and grabbed his hand. She said softly, I'm here. He pursed his lips and chuckled. Is the doctor here? At this moment, an unfamiliar voice said, Mr. Yi, let me help you take a look at your wound. Yi nodded and slowly opened his eyes. He looked at the doctor, but did not let go of the young lady's hand. Looking at the situation, the doctor could roughly guess what was going on. After all, the couple's bodies were in a terrible state. He sighed his heart. They really went too far. He stepped forward, removed the gauze, and carefully examined the wound. It was indeed a little inflamed, but a small wound should not have been inflamed to this extent. The doctor coughed lightly. Mr. Ye's injury still needs to rest. It's not suitable for strenuous exercise. Yi propped himself up and leaned against the headboard. He glanced at Cher and smiled faintly. Young and mischievous. Cher was infuriated. He was the one who was shameless, yet he was trying to pin the blame on her. She expressed that she would not take the blame, but the doctor didn't think so. His gaze fell on Yi neck, and then he shook his head. Don't do any strenuous exercise. Family members should be more patient with the patient. There's still a long way to go. Cher was about to explode, but he couldn't deny it. How could he say it out loud? Her gloomy expression pleased Mr. Yi. He kept holding her hand and rubbed it gently. The doctor took out the medicine box. As he prepared the medicine, he said, "I'll give you an antipyretic shot and an anti-inflammatory shot first to see if it will improve. If it doesn't work, you'll have to go to the hospital for an intravenous drip." Cher nodded. "Sorry to trouble you." The doctor gestured for her to lift her bathrobe, indicating that he was going to give her an injection somewhere on her lower body. Yimuyun looked at Cher. Chapter 2209. Cher pursed her lips and snorted. "Do it yourself." His eyes were meaningful, and in the end, she couldn't do it for him. She closed her eyes when she did it, which was very cute. Just looking at him like that made him feel less uncomfortable. He frowned slightly when the injection was done. Cher snorted. "You're already so old, yet you're still afraid of pain." She sounded a little angry when she said that. Yimuyun stretched his eyebrows and looked at her meaningfully. Who was the one who kept complaining about pain last night? Cher could naturally see that he was shameless. She didn't say anything and just stared at him. The doctor laughed. These two were quite interesting. They were really a match made in heaven. The doctor re-inflamed the wound, left a box of anti-inflammatory medicine, and left. Cher saw the doctor off and saw that it was getting late. When she was about to call room service, Yimuyun stopped her and said, "I don't want to eat anything else. Make some porridge for me." She glared at him. "It's been so many years. Don't tell me you haven't learned this?" There was a hint of mockery in his tone. Cher snorted. "It's such a simple thing. Do I need to learn it?" He chuckled and said, "Then try it." That little fool was tricked into doing it by him. She looked really cute from behind. Yimuyun leaned against the bed quietly, his eyes deep and the smile on his face deepened. Being with her like this, no matter how uncomfortable his body was, his heart was slowly filled up. She still wanted to escape, but he wouldn't let her go. He had lost her once, and in his heart, he thought that he would find her. He was sure that she would not be able to leave him because she was so stupid, so stupid. What could Tang Shui do without Yimuyun? However, the long wait made him slowly lose his patience. It wasn't until she appeared again that he realized that she was doing very well without him. Very well. He really didn't know whether he should be happy or unhappy. While he was thinking, the phone beside the bed rang. It was a call from Qin-mu. He picked it up and his voice was a little hoarse. "Mumu." Qin-mu's voice was still as gentle as before. "Brother, why didn't you and Cher come out?" Yimuyun was silent for a moment. He looked in the direction of the small kitchen and slowly said, "I was injured last night." Qin-mu was stunned for a moment and immediately asked worriedly, "Are you okay?" "Just a minor injury." Yimuyun said it indifferently, but Qin-mu still thought too much. After hanging up the phone, she looked at Zhou Chongwang. "I'm going to my brother's place. I'm worried." Zhou Chongwang smiled faintly. "I'll go with you. Otherwise, you'll probably feel a little uncomfortable." Sure enough, men knew men best. Qin-mu originally wanted to refuse, but in the end, she didn't and acquiesced. On the other side, Yimuyun put down the phone and felt much better. So he lifted the quilt, got up, and walked to the small kitchen. In the morning light, the little man stood in front of the counter, a little flustered. He hugged her from behind and rested his face on her shoulder. He chuckled and said, "You're so busy making porridge." Cher's body stiffened and she slowly turned around. "You can do it?" He smiled and said, "Of course." "Then, teach me," she said unexpectedly. Chapter 2210. Cher was stunned for a moment before her lips were kissed by him. She mumbled. There was still porridge in the pot, and it had to be burnt. But in Yimuyun's mind, it didn't matter if it was burnt. His kiss was a little deep, and Cher's neck was almost sprained. She pushed him away with her little hands, but she couldn't push him away. Really, did a patient have to be so strong? She only came to her senses when the smell of burnt food drifted past her nose. She gritted her teeth. Yimuyun. The smell of burnt food got stronger. Yimuyun chuckled and let go of her to turn off the stove. At this moment, there was a knock on the door of the suite. He ordered her in a low voice, "Open the door." Cher really didn't think too much. She walked over and opened the door. She was a little stunned the moment the door was opened. Qin-mu and Zhou Chongwang were standing at the door. She scratched her hair and couldn't decide whether to let them in or not. I heard from my brother that he's injured, so I came to see him. Chimu had always been a little timid in front of Cher, so her voice was very soft. Oh, Cher replied and opened the door wide. He's in the kitchen. Chimu frowned when she smelled something burnt. My brother's burnt. Cher looked a little uncomfortable. More or less. Zhou Chengwang was listening to the conversation between the two girls and felt amused. However, he clearly knew that the estrangement between them was all because of him. He didn't say anything and stood behind Qin Mu. Shui Er's gaze landed on him. When she saw the look in his eyes, she understood that Zhou Chengwang's heart was currently occupied by Qin Mu, and it held a significant weight. She thought that this was good. At least she didn't make a wrong choice 8 years ago. She could tell that Zhou Chengwang and Qin Mu should be together again. Even if Qin Mu didn't admit it, it was a fact. Thinking of this, he smiled. Come in. Qin Mu was still a little hesitant because she saw the messy bed just now. Her brother's illness should be caused by too much indulgence. The younger sister thought immorally and exchanged a glance with Zhou Chengwang. Zhou Chengwang's choice was to push her from behind. Qin Mu entered the door, and he followed. Cher closed the door and scratched her head. Yi Muyun is in the kitchen. Qin Mu looked at Zhou Chengwang and said softly, I'm going to see my brother. Zhou Chengwang, why don't you chat with Cher for a bit? Zhou Chengwang looked at his wife quietly for a long time before nodding his head. Cher, on the other hand, was a little surprised. Also, when did Qin Mu become so generous? What was there to talk about with her and Zhou Chengwang? But Qin Mu had already walked to the kitchen, leaving the space for Zhou Chengwang. At the scene, there were traces of the battle between Cher and Yi Muyun, and the atmosphere was a little ambiguous. Cher couldn't think of it, but Zhou Chengwang could guess what his little wife was thinking. She showed him these to tell him that something had happened between Cher and her brother, and that he shouldn't think about it anymore. She found it funny. Since when had he shown any interest in Tang Shui? During this reunion. Wasn't it obvious that he was behaving this night? Zhou Chengwang looked at Cher and smiled faintly. Is he okay? He paused and asked with a smile, Is Yi Muyun okay? I should be asking this. Chapter 2211. I'm asking on behalf of Qin Mu. Zhou Chengwang strolled to the opposite side of her and sat down. I don't think Yi Muyun would tell his own sister about such an embarrassing thing. I won't tell my enemy about such an embarrassing thing either. Cher snorted softly before biting her finger and ignoring him. Zhou Chengwang chuckled. Actually, he was starting to understand why he liked Qin Mu now. In some ways, Qin Mu was a little like Tang Cher. She would occasionally be mischievous as well. However, she was her. She wasn't a substitute for Tang Cher. He couldn't be clearer about that. He was a little distracted while talking to her. Cher could naturally tell. She went straight to the point and said, You've fallen for Qin Mu, haven't you? Zhou Chengwang smiled bitterly. Am I that obvious? You have the word infatuation written all over you. Cher said mockingly. Now that I think about it, wasn't my decision back then very stupid? If you had forced Qin Mu to die back then, you probably wouldn't have been able to experience what true love feels like in this lifetime. True love? Zhou Chengwang's heart was in turmoil. In Tang Cher's heart, was his true love for Qin Mu already? Cher wasn't interested in him. She didn't say anything else after saying that. She said that not because of Zhou Chengwang, but because of Qin Mu. She wanted Qin Mu to have one more choice. A man who was dead set on her. A man she had once loved. If she wanted to love, Zhou Chengwang was a smart man. He understood it in a short while. He felt a little complicated. Then, he said in a hoarse voice, Tang Cher, are you always so smart in front of others? You only act cute in front of Yi Muyun, right? Cher smiled faintly. I'm probably used to it. Hugging her knees, she looked in the direction of the kitchen and said softly, Zhou Chengwang, I know you want me to reconcile with him so that you can explain it to Qin Mu, but it's impossible. She looked at him and said calmly, But if you really like Qin Mu, please treat her well. Zhou Chengwang's expression was somewhat solemn. Why? I hope that the two of you can be together. Actually, it's not that great. I just feel that. I left unwillingly back then. If everything was destroyed in the end, I would feel even more unwillingly she said in a low voice. Without waiting for him to speak, she spoke in a soft voice that pierced through Zhou Chengwang's heart. In this lifetime, you owe me everything. Return all to Qin Mu. Zhou Chengwang closed his eyes. Even now, he could still remember the scene when he saw her on the campus, the way she looked asleep. That was a dream that he had hidden in his heart. Even when he was old, he would never forget it. However, the dream in his heart hated him. She had said it tactfully, but she had expressed it very clearly. Zhou Chengwang was speechless for a moment. After a long time, he sighed softly. I will. He looked in the direction of the kitchen, but he could only see the back of his little wife. She was talking to Yi Muyun. He could tell that she had a very gentle expression on her face. It was not like when they were together at all. It had been a long time since he had seen her like this. In the past, when she looked at him, her eyes would also be filled with pink. As Zhou Chengwang thought about it, he looked at Cher again. I'll get back her love. Cher did not say anything. Zhou Chengwang finally understood what was going on. In the kitchen, Qin Mu watched as Yi Muyun washed the burnt pot and put in new rice to make porridge. Chapter 22:12. She asked worriedly, Brother, what happened to the wound on your forehead? Yi Muyun said calmly, It's nothing. He paused for a moment and looked at his sister. There's always a price to pay for taking advantage of a woman. Qin Mu immediately covered her mouth, suppressing her voice. Was it Shuer who hit him? Yi Muyun nodded seriously and patted his sister's shoulder. Don't tell anyone else, or your brother will lose face. Qin Mu's gaze was a little complicated, and his voice was also very slow. Brother, what did you do to Shuer? Why did she hit you like that? Yi Muyun tilted his head and smiled. She went too far. As a result, Qin Mu instantly understood. Her brother's gaze was way too lascivious. But she immediately asked, shouldn't these minor injuries be fine? When she came, she met the hotel doctor, and he said that he had a high fever. Was it really okay? I took cold water to wash myself in the middle of the night. Yi Muyun lowered his voice and taught his sister a shameless lesson. Qin Mu was speechless. She stared at him for a long time and said slowly, Brother, you're so lame. How dare he play the trick of hurting himself? If Cher knew about it, she would definitely ignore him. That's why I can't let her know. Yi Muyun looked satisfied. Qin Mu swallowed his saliva before speaking his mind boldly. But it seems like Shuer doesn't feel that bad for you. Look, if you want to eat some porridge, you have to get up and cook it yourself. Mr. Yi looked at his sister and was speechless. She doesn't know how to do it. I don't think she needs to learn it. Qin Mu said matter-of-factly. I don't know how to do it either. But I don't need to know it at all. She looked at her brother mockingly and concluded, Brother, you're just a masochist who has nothing better to do. With that, Qin Mu walked out and ignored him. Yi Muyun snorted and said, Qin Mu, you just said that you can do it without learning it, right? Qin Mu almost bit off her tongue. She turned around and said with a fake smile, But I can't guarantee that it won't burn. You do it. The man who had been attacked by his sister said with some revenge, and then put the blame on his sister. Qin Mu didn't know how to do it. She was speechless. If she had known earlier, she would have said that her brother's trick of injuring himself to gain the confidence of others was great. Yi Muyun walked back to the living room happily. Zhou Chengwang looked at him and didn't see his little wife. He was surprised and asked, Where's Mu? In the kitchen. Yi Muyun smiled and said, She's making porridge for me. Zhou Chengwang knew that Qin Mu didn't do housework. How could she know how to cook porridge? If he knew, how could Yi Muyun not know? He did it on purpose. He really played the trick of hurting himself. Only Qin Mu, that fool, would be fooled by her black-bellied brother and obediently send herself to the door to be a cook. However, no matter how much he despised her for not living up to his expectations, his heart still ached for her. He got up and met Yi Muyun's gaze for a moment before saying indifferently, Let me do it. Qin Mu has never done these household chores before. Yi Muyun smiled and said, Then I'll have to trouble you, Zhou Zong. You're willing to do it. I didn't force you. Zhou Chengwang thought, You win. I can't beat you. Chapter 22:13. When Zhou Chengwang walked into the kitchen, Qin Mu looked up at him in surprise. Why are you here? Zhou Chengwang looked around and smiled. I'm here to see if there's anything I can help with. Oh, Qin Mu said. She lowered her head and stirred the boiling water. She had never done housework before, so she was flustered and didn't even know how to make porridge. She didn't pay attention, and the boiling water splashed on the back of her hand. Qin Mu let out a cry. Her voice was low, and she looked very pitiful. Zhou Chengwang grabbed her wrist and frowned. How is it? Qin Mu frowned and pursed her lips tightly. She didn't say anything for a long time. Zhou Chengwang checked and sighed. Why are you so stupid? Fortunately, it's not serious. He turned around to get some ointment and applied it on her. When he passed by the living room, his evil brother didn't even look at her. After applying the ointment on Qin Mu, Zhou Chengwang looked at her with disappointment. You don't know how to cook, but you still want to show off, huh? Qin Mu looked at him as if she was glaring at him. After a while, she snorted. Don't treat me like Cher, who doesn't know anything. Then what do you know? Zhou Chengwang put his hands in front of him and looked at her coldly. Do you know how to play the guqin or draw? Qin Mu was still staring at him. Yes, that's all I know. She looked very cute when she was angry. She was not like before, when she had to bear it no matter how angry she was. Zhou Chengwang smiled. It's good enough that you know these. He leaned forward and pinched her little face. His voice was very calm. I can do these rough jobs. She didn't know why, but Qin Mu heard some shamelessness in his words. She wanted to ask, but she couldn't, so she could only sulk. Zhou Chengwang skillfully washed the rice, put it into the pot, and covered it. Qin Mu sat at the small dining table, holding her chin and looking at his back. He was quite good at doing these housework. She knew that when they lived together in the house in Qingshui Road, he had never cooked. Did he learn all these skills in another woman's room? Qin Mu thought like this and asked the same question. Zhou Chengwang turned his body sideways and looked at her. Do you want to know? Qin Mu pursed her lips. I don't want to know. He sighed and walked to her side. He reached out and pulled her little head into his arms. He said softly, I only took care of Gumei for a few days when she was sick. As he said this, Qin Mu refused to stay in his embrace. What was he now? Did he want to make up with her, take Gumei back, and start his previous life again? Qin Mu didn't want to embarrass her brother, so she said in a low voice, I don't want to talk to you about this. Zhou Chengwang's voice was a little gentle. He kept looking up at her. Mu, this is the past I can't deny. Instead of letting you know in the future, it's better to... Qin Mu covered her ears. Zhou Chengwang, I don't want to hear this at any time. She was a little breathless after saying that. She stared at him and pursed her lips. Zhou Chengwang suddenly felt incredibly gentle. He reached out and rubbed her long hair. Silly girl. Qin Mu looked at him with tears in her eyes. I'm not. Chapter 22:14. Zhou Chengwang walked over, looked at the porridge, and continued in a faint voice. Mu, Gumei and I are not as close as you think. In fact, he knew that he had had so many women, but the only one Qin Mu cared about was Gumei. Qin Mu snorted. We've been in close contact. How is that not intimate? You've been taking care of her for a few days. Mu, are you jealous? His voice was low and hoarse, and then he laughed again. But I've never served Gumei's brother. When he said that, Zhou Chengwang was in a trance. Yes, he and Yi Muyun were enemies. For Qin Mu, he seemed to have let go of too much. But now that he suddenly realized it, he didn't regret it. Qin Mu snorted. You can go. No one wants you to serve me here. He carried her on his back and began to cook the porridge. His voice was clear and shallow. Mu, I'm willing. After finishing his work, he squatted in front of her in a humble manner. He held her little hand and looked up at her. Mu, forget everything in the past. Let's start over, okay? Qin Mu pursed her lips and looked at him. After a long time, she said in a hoarse voice, Zhou Chengwang, I can't do it now. But he knew that she had loosened up. At least she didn't refuse, didn't she? He reached out and rubbed her long hair. His voice was low and hoarse. I'll wait until you're willing. But you have to stay by my side. I'm afraid that once I let you go, you'll disappear. Qin Mu tried her best to calm down, but it was difficult. Her lips trembled slightly, and she couldn't say a word. She was held in his arms, and he cherished her in his heart. Qingmu felt that it was a little unreal. How could she and Zhou Chengwang have such a day? He treated her just like her brother treated Cher at that time. She couldn't tell if it was real or if he was playing. She only knew that she was falling into the abyss, unable to extricate herself. Qingmu ran away in a sorry state, while Zhou Chengwang was pushed aside by her. He wasn't annoyed. He just smiled and looked in the direction that Qingmu escaped. After a while, Cher walked in and asked with a frown, "What happened?" "She's probably a little embarrassed." Zhou Chengwang smiled, "Because she can't even make simple porridge." Cher looked at him in disgust and snorted. "Then you probably learned it from another woman." After saying that, she clapped her hands and stood up, ignoring him. Zhou Chengwang rubbed his nose, indicating that these girls had all grown up and were not to be trifled with. After Cher left, Yi Muyun arrived. He was already neatly dressed in a black shirt and black slacks. He exuded a sexy aura that was different from usual. He sat opposite Zhou Chengwang with an indifferent expression. Zhou Chengwang served him like a little wife and even made a side dish. Unexpectedly, Yi Muyun praised him lightly, making Zhou Chengwang feel like he was fucking a dog at his heart. Looking at Cher at the door, he coughed lightly again. "Mr. Yi, you have to take care of yourself. You can't neglect your body anymore. Don't do things like taking cold showers." He was extremely straightforward. If Cher still couldn't understand him, she would have to be stupid. She stood at the door and looked at Yi Muyun with widened eyes. Did he use the trick of self-injury? Chapter 22:15. She stood at the door and stared at Yi Muyun with her eyes wide open. Did he get a fever because he took a cold shower? Was that why it was inflamed? It was a trick of self-injury. If looks could be used as a knife, Yi Muyun would have been stabbed all over his body. At this moment, Zhou Chengwang got up and left with satisfaction. He patted the smell of oil off his body. "Mr. Yi is quite childish now." Yi Muyun looked at him. "Believe it or not, my words are still very effective on Qingmu. I believe in my influence on Qingmu more," Zhou Chengwang said confidently. Yi Muyun smiled. President Zhou really can't be mentioned in the same breath as before. Zhou Chengwang also smiled. Of course, people will change. As he said that, he left slowly. As soon as he left, Cher exploded. "Yi Muyun, you are shameless." Yi Muyun looked at her. "Can you use some new words to scold me? I'm a little tired of these words." Cher was so angry that her face turned pale and then red. She could only stare at him. He was angry and amused at the same time. He reached out to her. "Come here. I will teach you how to scold people." "I don't want to learn." She was angry and wanted to run away, but he was very fast. She only ran for a while before she was caught in his arms. His fever had not completely subsided. His arms were hotter than usual. She was buried in his arms like that. She wanted to struggle, but she could not. Yi Muyun held her little body firmly and said with a seductive voice, "You are angry just like that?" He leaned close to her ear and said in a low and warm voice, "You should say he taught her a lot of words shamelessly." Cher could not bear to listen to him. She covered her ears and refused to listen. Yi Muyun chuckled softly and teased her even more shamelessly. Deep in love, she still kissed her on the lips. Cher resisted, a little disgusted. "You will infect me. This isn't contagious." He chuckled, pressing her down and kissing her to his heart's content. When he kissed her lips one last time, he asked seriously, "Cher, have you learned everything I've taught you?" She was afraid that he would teach her again, so she blushed and softly fell on his shoulder. Her breathing was erratic. I know. Then take the initiative to kiss me once." His voice was hot, with a hint of teasing. Cher bit her lips. He laughed even more wantonly. "Well, I just taught you was kissing." Cher was speechless. Could he be any more shameless? However, his heart ached for her, so he let her eat some porridge first and specially said, "Zhou Chengwang's cooking is not bad." Cher stared at him and finally understood what Zhou Chengwang meant. Her gaze was also a little deep. She didn't say anything and lowered her head to eat the porridge. "What's wrong? You look like you're afraid of me." He smiled faintly and reached out to stroke her long hair. Cher pursed her lips and said slowly, I just feel. She looked at him. You wouldn't have used such tricks on me in the past. Yimian looked at her and smiled. People change. Besides, these little tricks are nothing. Nothing? Cher murmured. Then if I lie to you one day, will you forgive me? Will you still think that it's a joke? He looked at her and smiled faintly. Of course, I can forgive you for everything. Cher looked at him. Everything? Chapter 22:16. Cher shook her head and replied indifferently. No. That was because they had broken up 8 years ago. No matter what she did, she could not say that she had let him down. Yi Muyun pursed his thin lips as his gaze deepened. They were unusually silent. In this silence, each of them was filled with their own thoughts. He was thinking about what had happened to her in the past 8 years that even Gu Zhe could not find out about. He wanted to ask, but he knew that she would not say it. Between them, it was even more difficult than between Qin Mu and Zhou Chengwang. Zhou Chengwang and Qin Mu only needed Qin Mu to think it through and turn back. And his Cher was not someone who was willing to turn back. He could feel that it was only expedient for her to be with him. Her concern was out of guilt as well. As long as he let go, she would be able to turn around and leave. As for him, how could he possibly let her go? He would not even if he died. After a long time, he smiled out faintly and pinched her little face. I believe that you wouldn't dare to. She knew that he was either compromising or changing the topic. Forcing out a smile, she finished the porridge. Zhou Chengwang's dishes are pretty decent. If he's serious about Qin Mu, he'll definitely be a good husband in the future, Cher said in a low voice. Yi Mian looked at her. What about me? Can't I? Cher replied awkwardly. You'll have to ask your fiancé about that. Not for the time being. So, I'd like to ask you if I'm all right in all aspects. When he said all aspects, he emphasized each word with a deep meaning behind it. Cher harumphed out softly. I'm not sure. I don't understand. There's no comparison. Still, those words pleased him as he did not make things difficult for her anymore. Pulling her along to rest, he called the F&B of the hotel and ordered lunch before going to bed. When Cher heard that he had ordered a rather luxurious meal, she glared at him. How can you eat such a sumptuous meal when you're sick? I ordered it for you. He lay down and pulled her into his arms. His large palm caressed her small body. I can't let you drink porridge with me, can I? Otherwise, people will say that I didn't raise you well. At this moment, the two of them were lying together, and they were actually quite intimate. Cher also knew that she couldn't break free. Moreover, he was sick, so she just let him be. Her little face rested on his shoulder, and she still spoke clearly. Yi Muyun, I will return to America. Everything that we have now is all. Her little mouth was kissed. He didn't kiss her for long. He just pecked her lightly, not letting her say anything that would make him unhappy. After a long time, when both of their auras were a bit chaotic, he said hoarsely, I know. Cher's little face rested on his shoulder, and her voice was a little low. Do you want me to apologize? No need. His voice was a little heavy. Don't mention it when we're together, or I'll get angry. Cher didn't say anything and buried her face in his neck. After a long time, Yi Muyun felt that his neck was wet and warm. He opened his eyes abruptly and looked at her. Cher, are you crying? There were tear stains on her face. She didn't want him to see it, so she buried her head and cried. At this moment, she wasn't saying that they were a one-night stand. Instead, she was like an 18-year-old girl who was helpless and fragile and needed him to coax her. He cupped her little face and wanted to comfort her, but she refused. Chapter 22:17. She hugged his neck and hugged him tightly. Don't ask, can you hug me? In America, on the streets, in the dark alleys. She missed him so much, but he never appeared. She had imagined so many scenes. She could bury herself in his arms and cry like this. And now, it had finally come true. Perhaps she came back not because she was safe, but because she wanted to see him. Him having a girlfriend was just an excuse for her. She simply wanted to come back to see him. Shue'er looked up at him, her small and full lips trembling slightly. Slowly, She leaned forward and kissed him softly. Yun didn't move. She was the one who initiated everything, from the kiss to the end. This was the first time she had taken the initiative ever since they had sex. He felt that the person in his arms was no longer that young girl, but a mature woman. She was so familiar with his body and knew how to make him happy. She did not hold back and pleasured him at the height of his passion. His throat moved and he made a shameful sound. It was soothing and lingering. When it was over, everything was so beautiful. "Are you okay?" Her little face was placed on his chest, listening to his intense heartbeat. The sound was also lingering. Yun smiled faintly and looked down at her. This should be asked by a man. Her little arms hugged his waist tightly, and she buried her face in his arms again. "But I did something that only a man would do just now." He reached out his hand and touched her black hair. Her sweat was damp, and it was cool. Cher lay in his arms and closed her eyes. Yun's gaze was unfathomable. He could feel her feelings, but even more so, he could feel that her actions were resolute. "Cher, let's get married, okay?" he suddenly said. The person in his arms opened her eyes suddenly. She didn't raise her eyes, but looked straight at the nearest place. After being stunned for a while, she said softly, "Isn't it good for us to be like this? Why don't we get married?" He said hoarsely, "We've done it many times, sometimes without protection. Maybe we already have a child." Cher's gaze became even more focused. "Child." She sat up with the sheets and looked at him. "There won't be any children." Yun's gaze was a little cold. "Did you take your medicine?" "No. It's not easy for me to get pregnant." Cher smiled faintly. "Falling into the frozen lake once, Gong Han. Do you know what that means?" Yun was naturally aware of this. Startled for a moment, he said almost immediately, "If we don't have a child, we can adopt one." Cher looked at him. "Yun, I like life in New York. I'm sorry, but I can't marry you, let alone adopt a child with you." She had a feeling that she couldn't stay any longer. He had already sensed something and didn't want to let her go. Therefore, she couldn't care less and was ready to hand him over to Chinmu to take care of. She had to leave. She got out of bed and went straight to the changing room. After a while, she came out with a new set of clothes. Yun did not stop her, because he knew that she would definitely go back to B City. Her things were all in B City. His gaze was a little distant as he took out his phone and made a call. "Help me find a lawyer." Chapter 22:18. Yun said calmly, "Just do as I say." Guze was silent for a long time, but he didn't say anything in the end. Yun hung up the phone, took out a cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and smoked slowly. He stood by the window and looked at the sea in the distance. After a long time, he went into the changing room and changed his clothes. There was a black limousine parked at the entrance of the hotel. Yun got into the car and asked calmly, "Has everything been arranged for Miss Tang?" The driver nodded and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Yi. I've arranged for someone to send Miss Tang to the nearest airport." Yun closed his eyes and leaned against the back seat to sleep. He hadn't fully recovered yet, and he still had a fever. But since she had left, there was no point for him to stay, so he might as well go back to City B. Of course, Yun took a private plane back to City B 2 hours earlier than Cher. At the airport, when Yun's private plane took off, Cher sat in the waiting room, holding the phone in her hand. After hesitating for a long time, she called Chinmu. After about 4 or 5 rings, Chinmu answered Cher. Cher said softly, "I'm at the airport." Chinmu was stunned and asked instinctively, "Where's my brother?" "He's still in the hotel." Cher pursed her lips. "You can go and have a look." Chinmu hung up the phone, looked at Zhou Chongwang, and kicked him. "What kind of lousy show is this? It's a reality show, and there's no one here." After saying that, Chinmu walked towards the door of the room, and Zhou Chongwang immediately followed her. But when they arrived at Yun's bedroom, only the waiter was cleaning the room and said that he had checked out. Chinmu was stunned for a moment, and then she turned around and left. "Where are you going?" Zhou Chongwang grabbed her arm and asked in a low voice. Chinmu looked at him. "I want to go back to B City." However, Zhou Chongwang didn't let go of her hand. He said in a low voice, "Moo, they have to solve their own problems. You don't live for them." Chinmu struggled with all her might, but she couldn't break free. She looked at him and said word by word, "But because of me, they gave up once." She struggled fiercely, and this time he released her, because he realized that he couldn't find a reason. Qin Mu quickly returned to her room and packed her things in a flurry. Zhou Chengwang pressed his hand on the back of her hand and said in a low voice, "I'll clean it up." She looked at him. "What about your show?" "Ruin," he said casually. "Just take it as a vacation." Qin Mu pursed her lips and asked him to prepare the plane. In the end, both Qin Mu and Zhou Chengwang returned to B City, but Cher hadn't arrived yet. Originally, Qin Mu wanted to wait for someone at the airport, but Zhou Chengwang took her away. "Qin Mu, the more you act like this, the more Tang Shui will want to escape. Your brother is already suffocating her. Now that you're here, think about it." In the end, Qin Mu listened to his opinion and got into the car that came pick her up. After half a day of running, she was so tired that she fell asleep. Zhou Chengwang looked at her neck and smiled. Didn't she feel uncomfortable? He reached out to pull her head onto his shoulder, and his gaze became gentle. He looked at her like that until they reached the house in Qingshui Road. Qin Mu was probably too tired. When the driver opened the door for them, she didn't wake up. Chapter 22:19. Mr. Zhou. Xiaozhang hesitated for a moment. "Should I wake him up?" "No, you can rest first," Zhou Chengwang said calmly, then picked up Qin Mu and walked to the hall. Qin Mu woke up. Looking at the lights in the hall, she seemed to have recognized the place. She struggled a little and said, "Why are we here? Sleep a little longer. Stay here for now." Zhou Chengwang's voice was very soft and comforting. Qin Mu pursed her lips. She couldn't fight against the drowsiness, so she fell asleep. She felt very tired. She had been very tired recently. She had a vague feeling in her heart, but she didn't know if it was true. It shouldn't be. She had always been taking medicine. Zhou Chengwang put her on the soft bed and sat by the bed, looking at her quietly. Her little face was a little pale because of the long journey, and her eyes were closed quietly. He looked at her like this, and he felt satisfied even if he looked at her without any feelings. He thought that he might have fallen in love with his little wife after she finally learned to play with him and be rough with him. He also lay down and lay with her in his clothes. This feeling was wonderful enough. Qin Mu didn't wake up until 10 o'clock at night. She opened her eyes and saw Jun Yin in front of her. Only then did she remember that he had brought her here. Qin Mu pursed her lips and said in a hoarse voice, "Why are you here? You asked that when you came." He smiled. "Mumu, move back." Qin Mu looked down and said indifferently, "I don't want to do this. What are you worried about?" He leaned against the bed and stroked her long hair. "If you're worried, we can sleep in separate rooms." Qin Mu was a little surprised and looked up at him. Zhou Chengwang was still smiling. "If you don't want it." Qin Mu's face was slightly red as he snorted, "I've never thought about it." "Then we'll sleep in separate rooms." His forehead rested against hers. "You got to give me a detention, don't you?" Qin Mu didn't say anything, so he knew that she was trying to trick him. Then he chuckled softly. "All right, let's go downstairs and eat something. I want to see my brother." Qin Mu looked up and grabbed his sleeve with her slender fingers. Zhou Chengwang looked at her little hand with a burning gaze, and Qin Mu immediately moved her fingers away. He smiled and did not expose her. Then he got up and carried her in his arms. "Put me down." Qin Mu immediately hugged his neck and said anxiously, "You said we slept in separate rooms." His eyes were clear and bright as he stared at her dainty little face. He slowly said, "But I didn't say I wouldn't hug you. Shameless." Qin Mu reached out and punched him, but those punches and rusty legs did not hurt him at all. Instead, he smiled and went downstairs. When they reached downstairs, Qin Mu realized that the servants in the house had returned, and they were the people she was used to using in the past. "Are you touched?" He placed her on the dining chair and sat opposite her. He smiled. It wasn't easy to invite them back. "I'm just short of apologizing." She knew what he meant. She snorted. "It's none of my business. You did it willingly." Zhou Chengwang gestured for the dishes to be served before he said slowly, "Yes, I did it willingly." Qin Mu did not want to pay attention to him because it meant that she was losing. She didn't want that. She still hadn't thought it through. Chapter 2220. Zhou Chengwang pursed his lips and didn't force her. He just served her food from time to time. The servants at home were all watching. Qin Mu was a little embarrassed. She said in a voice like a kitten, "Enough. Eat more. You're too thin." He smiled and supported his good-looking chin. "It won't feel good." Qin Mu couldn't stand it and growled, "Zhou Chengwang." There were other people here. How could he speak so bluntly? He didn't care and lowered his voice. It's normal for a husband and wife to say some sweet words. However, Qin Mu was a conservative child. Her face was still red after a while. After eating, she asked him to take her to Yi Muyun's apartment. When Zhou Chengwang got up, he complained, "You only have your brother in your heart. Don't you have your husband?" Qin Mu opened the car door and got into the car. After sitting down, she snorted. "We're getting a divorce." "That's right. But we only had sex 3 times this morning, didn't we?" He turned his face and kindly reminded Mrs. Zhou. Mrs. Zhou's face was completely red. This time, she couldn't say a word. She regretted going back to Qingshui Road with him. When Zhou Chengwang started the car, he gently pinched her little face. "Do you regret it?" "Yes." She didn't stand on ceremony and directly admitted it. He chuckled and drove the car out of the villa. The black sports car drove at a speed of 60 kilometers per hour. Because it was late at night, there weren't many cars on the road. After a while, Qin Mu turned around and looked at him. "You can drive faster. Mu, be careful." He took the time to glance at her, then took out a cigarette, lit it, and took a puff. The driver now is a man who has been indulging himself too much. "Qin Mu, Zhou Chengwang, can you not mention this?" Qin Mu's voice was a little annoyed. Zhou Chengwang rolled down the window and rested his elbow on the window. His tone was indifferent. "You won't let me do it. Can I talk about it?" She laughed again. "Mrs. Zhou, you're meddling too much." Qin Mu turned his face away and didn't say another word. She looked at the dark night outside and suddenly remembered that this was the first time she had sat in his car. After being together for so many years, other than at home and on necessary occasions, they rarely spent time together. Qin Mu felt a little emotional. She didn't like to talk and just played with her fingers. After smoking a cigarette, Zhou Chengwang stopped. He held the steering wheel with both hands and drove toward Yi Muyun's apartment. But when she arrived, Yi Muyun wasn't in the apartment. Qin Mu dialed his number, but it was busy. After hanging up the phone, she looked up at Zhou Chengwang and said, "I can't find my brother." Zhou Chengwang pursed his lips and took her cell phone. "Ask Gu Zhe." As he spoke, he found Gu Zhe's number. When he flipped it out, he looked at his wife with a meaningful gaze. Under his gaze, Qin Mu almost exploded. "Zhou Chengwang, you and Gu Mei are not clear. Don't suspect others." "I didn't say that." He smiled meaningfully and then dialed the number. "Let me speak." Qin Mu wanted to grab the phone from his hand, but Zhou Chengwang grabbed her with one hand and pulled her into his arms. Then he said to Gu Zhe, "I'm Zhou Chengwang. Mumu wants to know Yi Muyun's whereabouts." You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.